I thank the chairman and want to thank Madam Chair and a ranking member for their testimony from being here today. I want to follow up on a point that my colleague referenced about, in particular, H.R. 6914, the Pregnant Students' Rights Act, and this notion that it's designed to simply provide more information. And so just to drill down a bit on this, Madam Chair, on page 5 of the bill, in section 2, it's titled Information Content, and I'll just read this. It's the information described in this paragraph is the following. Subparagraph A list of resources on campus and in the community that exist to help a pregnant student in carrying the baby to term and caring for the baby after birth. Do you see that language there?
It's
subparagraph A. Page 5, subparagraph A.
Yeah, subparagraph A.
It starts with a list of resources.
Sure.
Okay. So a list of resources on campus and in the community that exist to help a pregnant student in carrying the baby to term and caring for the baby after birth. What are those resources that this bill is contemplating?
Well, it would depend on the community. It would depend on what the community has to offer.
There are no universal resources, irrespective of what community you're in. I mean, I take this language to be that the federal, you're acquiring these institutions of higher education to promulgate resources, and you're saying that every school's booklet is going to be different?
No, we're saying that, that what exists, we're not requiring them to create any additional resources. We're just asking them to provide a list of the resources on campus and in the community. There's no requirement to create any resources.
So what would those resources be?
Well, there might be on campus facility, childcare facilities. There might be, there'll be probably in the community childcare facilities. There might be information on food pantries, for example, if a student needed that kind of help. There might be information on pediatricians who are in the area.
Let me follow up on the food.
Anybody can think if you have a baby, what kind of resources do you need?
Sure. Well, so with respect to the food pantry, it's a good example. I went online. The American Pregnancy Association has a list of financial resources that are available to pregnant mothers to better inform them about the resources that might be available. The first item on their list is WIC, Women, Infants, and Children Supplemental Fund Program, right? You're familiar with WIC?
Yes.
Of course, right? The Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children. It's the #1 resource on this website that I went on. And my understanding is that House Republicans, 190 of them in this Congress, voted to rescind $500 million in WIC funding. You recall that vote back in September?
Not in particular the numbers or anything about the vote.
Well, I can represent to you that in September of last year, 190 House Republicans voted to rescind $500 million in WIC funding, and that included you as well. The next item on the list here is pregnancy Medicaid is listed as one of the financial resources. Of course, many House Republicans, most House Republicans oppose the expansion of Medicaid. I take it you do as well. Is that a fair assessment?
That's a fair assessment, but I have no idea what that has to do with this bill.
Well,
This is a very simple bill to help students. It's a very pro-student
Here's
bill.
what I'll suggest to you, Madam Chair. This is why it matters. The American Pregnancy Association lists as financial resources, one of those resources available to pregnant women is pregnancy Medicaid, so that they can access health care for them and for their child. House Republicans, including yourself, oppose expanding Medicaid for pregnant mothers in a variety of different states across the country. That's why it's relevant. And as you can see, where I'm struggling is understanding what information you are compelling these institutions of higher education to actually provide, to the extent that it's any of these resources, they're all resources that House Republicans seem intent on cutting. And those are just a few. I mean, the next one on here is temporary assistance for needy families, TANF. Again, a program that House Republicans have voted to decrease over the course of this Congress. So I guess what I'm getting at, and maybe you can help me understand this, is if the goal here is to provide, as the bill says, a list of resources to assist pregnant mothers, and if we know those resources, pregnancy Medicaid, TANF, WIC, a variety of others, are so critically important, why do House Republicans seem so intent on cutting them all? That's really my question.
Again, you're creating a straw dog here. This bill.
What was that?
This bill is pro-student. Surely, members on both sides of the aisle want to support women becoming mothers and college graduates. There are resources now. Whether or not we oppose some of those resources being funded by taxpayers at the federal level is irrelevant to this discussion. They exist. Since they exist,
So the plan
then
is,
the students should know about them and take advantage of them. It's simple as that. You guys are throwing out straw dogs constantly about this bill.
Madam Chair, I would simply say, it seems to me the plan is to mandate the provision of a list of resources, of programs that Republicans are trying to dismantle in Washington. I don't really understand the utility in compelling the production of a list that says, hey, supplemental nutrition assistance program resources are available to you, unless Republicans have a majority in the Congress, in which case it's not worth much more than the piece of paper that this bill apparently is compelling the production of. But again, I guess what I would say, Madam Chair, and it's with all respect, I would be far more interested, I think, in debating and moving forward a bill that funds these resources, that funds these critical programs, TANF, WIC, SNAP, expanding Medicaid, to ensure that pregnant mothers have those resources, as opposed to passing a bill that mandates the creation of a list that lists them out. Ranking Member Scott, I know I want to give you an opportunity.
I'd like to respond
Sure,
to that.
of course.
We are the Education Committee. We're dealing with students. We're not the Appropriations Committee. That's Mr. Cole and other folks. So perhaps, since Mr. Cole's here, he can hear you say what you want funded. What should be funded is not in our purview, but these things already exist. And so we just want to make sure that students are aware of them. And we want the students to be taken care of. We want their babies to be taken care of. We want them to complete their college education. And so whatever exists, they should have access to it. And if they don't already know about it, we want the school to tell them. Very simple bill, very pro-student, not anti-anything. We're not here to speak against WIC or any of those things. That's a different subject. Thank you.
I hear you, Madam Chair, and I hope the appropriators hear us as well. I'm not on the Appropriations Committee, but the only caveat I suppose I would add is that you keep on referencing these programs existing. They exist for now. House Republicans have worked very hard to cut them to the bone over the last 14 months. So, the fact that you'd like to provide a list of resources around WIC or SNAP or TANF to pregnant mothers while the House Republican majority seeks to defund all of these programs just seems a bit disconnected, in my view, from the views and the values and the wishes of the American people. But Ranking Member Scott, I want to give you an opportunity to.
Thank you, and I think your comments highlight a real shortcoming of the legislation. It gives partial information to begin with. It doesn't give any information on contraception, resources if you experience a miscarriage, if you're going to choose to terminate the pregnancy for any reason. Just gives you partial information, and then in terms of resources, it doesn't give you anything. So that's, if you are trying to make an informed decision, you can't make an informed decision if you're only hearing one side. I would also say to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, when you talked about the allegations, we did ask for a documentation for the findings, and the sponsor of one of the major parts of that finding was unable to provide documentation.
I thank the ranking member, I thank the chair, and I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you. Gentlelady from New Mexico.
I thank the chairman and thank both of the witnesses for their testimony. I would echo the remarks of my colleagues, of the ranking member and of the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania. This hearing is nonsensical. The notion that we would consider this bill on an emergency basis, a bill that was introduced last night, a bill that has had no legislative hearing, no witnesses, no markup, no CBO score. That's your emergency? To say nothing of the disregard for regular order for the last year and a half, certainly since I've been on this Rules Committee, I've heard from many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle talk about the need for regular order, making that their so-called imperative, only to see week after week them jettison the same principles that they claim to adhere to. There's an article in Punchbowl yesterday, I'm going to quote from it, because I think it's a great summation of why we're here. Quote, "In what might be the most predictable turn of events of this Congress, the moderate New York Republicans who were upset about the tax bill, the bill we considered last night, not including changes to SALT deductions, have backed down in exchange for almost nothing. The House Republican leadership has told the New Yorkers, principally Reps Nick LaLota, Mike Lawler, Anthony D'Esposito, and Andrew Garbarino, that they'll work on a bill allowing more deductions for state and local taxes for married couples, possibly for a vote next week. But it's not clear what that bill would even look like according to aides in and outside of the leadership. Of course, we now know in the late introduction last night what that bill looks like. There's a saying, this is from the article, in House Republican leadership circles, moderates always fold. In this case, that is true. But the moderates here really didn't have many cards to play. I disagree with only one sentence in that quote, and that's the last sentence, because of course they did have a card to play. They could have voted against the bill last night if they felt so passionate about this particular proposal, but they didn't. So I recognize that some folks think that this will prove to their electoral benefit, that it'll inure to their electoral benefit. I'm here to tell you it's simply not the case. The American people can see this for the farce that it is. And to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, in particular those whom I have respect for and have engaged in many a colloquy over the course of this last year in terms of regular order, I would just hope that perhaps you would adhere to the principles that you claim to support. At the risk of quoting Punchbowl twice, a reporter, as Tom knows, reporter Jake Sherman just tweeted this out. I thought it was an astute point. This rules vote, apparently he's why he may be the only person watching this hearing. Some wealthy folks in New York, I guess, but this rules vote on SALT is a true test of whether Rep. Ralph Norman, Rep. Thomas Massey, and Chip Roy, Texas, or their Twitter X handles, are true adherents to regular order. This SALT bill was introduced last night, hasn't gone through committee, no CBO score, et cetera, et cetera. I think he's right. It's a great test, an astute and salient point. Because I just cannot imagine, putting aside the merits, the impact that this bill has, in terms of the hardworking people of South Carolina or Kentucky. I'm not convinced that this SALT proposal is a huge priority for your respective constituencies. Perhaps you'll you'll inform me otherwise. But putting aside the merits of the proposal, certainly with respect to regular order and the need for it, this doesn't fit the bill. And I'm not going to yield to my colleague, Mr. Massey, because I think he's next in the order here. So I eagerly await his rationale. But this isn't the way to do business. It's no way to run a train station, no way to run a government, no way to administer the Rules Committee or a majority. But if your goal is to administer the most chaotic, dysfunctional, and unproductive Congress in the modern history of the country, then this is probably the way to do it. So with that, I yield back.
I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from Colorado is recognized for whatever questions he has for the panel.
I thank the chairman. First, let me just say I'll thank the gentleman, Mr. Massey, for reminding us of one of the darkest days in the history of our republic, January 6th. And by the way, a day that ultimately led to a permissible and appropriate and prudent and necessary impeachment when former President Trump was impeached for his conduct leading up to and, of course, including January 6th. I find it fascinating that my friend from Kentucky takes issue with the work of the committee, apparently shows great interest in the work of the committee. I believe he voted against creating the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on our nation's capital, a bipartisan committee that was led with great distinction and integrity by then Chairman, now Ranking Member Thompson. I think it's patently absurd to ask questions regarding what was a thorough and comprehensive multi-year investigation without giving the benefit to the witnesses of having the report and the evidentiary record to be able to answer the gentleman's questions. By the way, of course, we're here on a completely different subject, the baseless impeachment that House Republicans have initiated against Secretary Mayorkas. I, for one, am grateful for the work that the January 6th committee did and for Chairman Thompson's leadership of the same. I have a number of questions with respect to the actual subject that we are gathered here today to talk about, but before I get into that, I do want to give Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Thompson, an opportunity, to the extent he'd like one, to respond and perhaps make any comments with respect to the gentleman from Kentucky's soliloquy or diatribe or whatever we want to call it.
Well, whatever the gentleman from Kentucky has uncovered, it's still not too late to provide that information to the authorities, and hopefully we can capture some people. And I would encourage him to do so. I think we all ought to be embarrassed at what happened on January 6th, but we also should fear some of the danger that went on that day. And I hope our report talks about how misinformation improperly promulgated causes people to do strange things, including planting pipe bombs. So if there's evidence somewhere between ATF, Secret Service, FBI, I think they should be made aware of the videos, and I look forward to, if the chairman decides to move on some subpoenas with whomever, it would be a good opportunity to add to the record of the work of the Select Committee.
I thank the ranking member, and again, extend to him, I think, our gratitude for the work that the Select Committee on January 6th accomplished. Chairman Green, I want to talk to you about the subject that we're gathered here to talk about, which is the impeachment proceedings that you've initiated and the resolution against Secretary Mayorkas. I think it's pretty clear to me, I suspect to most Americans who've been watching this proceeding and who watch the proceeding tomorrow on the floor, that this is a total waste of time. It is going nowhere, and it is a distraction from the real necessary work that Congress needs to perform to address the consequential challenges that we face as a country. Chairman Green, I have an editorial here. I'm going to enter it into the record. It's The title is Americans Are the Victims of the Impeachment Inquiry. It's an opinion piece. The subtext is a lot of bipartisan legislation that enjoys widespread support sits gathering dust while Congress focuses on the impeachment inquiry. I assume you disagree with this?
I do.
You do. It's interesting. These are your words. This is an editorial that you wrote 5 years ago during the debate about the impeachment of former President Trump. It's written by Mark Green, guest columnist in the Tennessean, local newspaper, I take it, in your state.
It is indeed, Nashville.
Americans are the victims of the impeachment inquiry. A lot of bipartisan legislation that enjoys widespread support sits gathering dust while Congress focuses on the impeachment inquiry. It's fascinating to me that you've changed your tune, and I'll give you a chance to respond in a moment, Mr. Chairman. I'll ask that this be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Part of the challenge for me and so many of my colleagues on this side of the aisle is the hypocrisy that unfortunately we see from our colleagues who argue one thing and then a week later, a month later, a year later, 4 years later, as the case may be in this instance, argue the exact opposite. Now, the chairman, or the former chairman, our ranking member, Mr. McGovern, asked you, Mr. Green, Chairman Green, a series of questions about process. And I want to give you a chance, to perhaps expound upon a bit of this and maybe explain to me and the American public your thinking. Is it your contention that you went into this impeachment proceeding with an open mind? You're not, I assume, taking that position, right?
It depends on sort of the process when someone becomes convinced that it's the right thing to do. Sure. I can't tell you exactly the day when I said, no, this really is, he needs to be impeached.
Can you give me a time period? A season?
Gosh, I mean,
Spring,
we started
fall,
this
winter?
almost as soon as we got into the majority, so, no, I couldn't tell you when I actually made the decision.
It seems like you were about to say maybe springtime, which would comport with the New York Times article that Chairman McGovern mentioned. And I know, and I'll give you a chance to, perhaps if you want to, again, expound upon this. That article is from April of last year. This is a quote from that article. The Republican chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee promised donors this month that he would produce an impeachment case against the Biden administration's Homeland Security Chief, Alejandro Mayorkas, saying that the secretary's appearance before the panel this week would be the beginning of his demise, end quote. So this is before your committee has heard from Secretary Mayorkas. It's before you've had the witnesses that apparently have come before your committee. It's before you've had any meaningful debate. You decide a year ago, maybe a little less than a year ago, that you're impeaching him.
That's not what we said.
So is this article inaccurate?
Yeah, parts of it are, actually.
And you take, as Mr. McGovern.
I've been queried about this many times.
Okay, well, I think it's important to get to the bottom of that because apparently the New York Times, at least in this article, says this is based on audio recordings of you at this event, that apparently Mr. Jordan, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee on which I serve, was also in attendance. So, if that's inaccurate, I think you should get it corrected because to me, it seems like, and I just can tell you, as the American people begin to dig into this and learn more, I think what it will seem like to them is that this process was rigged, that it was stacked, that at the end, and I know that you all and House Republicans and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have taken issue when you believe that an impeachment proceeding is rigged or stacked from the very beginning, as this impeachment proceeding was. And just to give you an example of this, in October of 2019, your office issued a statement. This was following your vote against initiating an impeachment inquiry against former President Trump. The first 4 words of this press release, quote, "The vote is rigged." The next 4 words, "The deck is stacked. That's why I will be voting no on today's resolution to formalize the impeachment inquiry against President Trump." So you took issue with a rigged process in your view, what you characterized as a rigged process back then. 5 years later, you're head of this committee. You're, a court apparently telling folks that you were going to proceed with impeaching Secretary Mayorkas 10 months before you actually initiate those articles. I don't know how you square that, but I'll give you an opportunity.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
thanks. No, we started a 5-phase process almost as soon as we came in here, looking at I'll give you the 5 phases: dereliction of duty. The second phase was how the open border had, empowered the drug cartels. The third phase was the human cost, and we brought in all sorts of people to talk about human trafficking and the deaths of fentanyl and things like that. We had a phase that was the costs. And, it's huge, $400 and something billion that the open borders costing the economy. And then waste, the empty ice beds, the empty hotel beds. This took almost a year. We've been at this almost a year. So
Can I ask you about that
to suggest that it's some kind of abbreviated, rushed process that's fabricated or whatever. I don't remember your exact words, but that's not fair. That's not a fair characterization. This has been a very thorough, systematic process that was done to get to the details and produce a report that's 400 pages long.
I hear you. Let me ask you about the 5-phase plan, because it's interesting. Apparently you say that some of these quotes are misquoted in terms of this New York Times article. The 5-phase plan piece of it was not.
That's right. We talked about what the intentions were, but not what the conclusion is.
I see.
Yeah, very important.
So the part where the New York Times says, quote, that you had a, quote, 5-phase plan for doing so, and that the Homeland Security would, quote, put together a packet and we will hand it to Jim Jordan and let Jim do what Jim does best. That part is true. The part where you say that you're proceeding with impeaching Secretary Mayorkas, that part is false. That's the...
I'd have to go back and look at that again, but this is what I do know. I have looked at it in the past. This was months ago when it was brought up by my colleagues on the committee, and there were aspects of that article that were not true. That's what I do know.
I'll move on to talking a bit about the process.
Okay.
That press release that I quoted in 2019 your office identified a number of issues that you took with respect to the process that the former President Trump experienced in terms of the first impeachment back in 2019. You stated at that time, this resolution, this is a quote, this resolution consolidates Adam Schiff's power and cuts out the small number of members who've been able to take part in hearings so far by moving the jurisdiction to Schiff's Intelligence Committee, okay, end quote. Now, I know you understand this as the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee. The Judiciary Committee has conventionally, traditionally, by centuries of precedent, been considered the committee that marks up articles, right?
Yeah, that's why I mentioned in the article you quoted, I was talking
exactly,
about... Yeah.
Right, I hear you. In this case, impeachment was done exclusively within the Homeland Security Committee, right?
By a vote for the House floor with
I hear
201 Democrats voting.
Understand.
And the motion made by the Democrats,
and apparently, you take no issue with the fact that this proceeding was limited to the Homeland Security Committee, to a small group of members to participate. You took great issue with this same approach 5 years ago. Again, part of my frustration, and I think the frustration that the American people experience, is this sense of hypocrisy, that this isn't on the level. I'll give you another example. This perhaps was the most astounding example of all. This press release states, and I'll quote, this is in reference to the impeachment resolution, the resolution subjects the minority's subpoena authority to Schiff's whims and refuses to guarantee that the minority's witnesses will even be called, end quote. Ranking Member Thompson, did you have subpoena authority in this proceeding?
For?
To call witnesses?
Yes.
And was that authority limited anyway? Did it require the approval of the chairman or any kind of assent?
In terms of, repeat it again, your question.
With respect to the subpoena authority that the minority had in Homeland Security in this proceeding, you weren't able to call witnesses that you believed were deemed relevant.
No.
It required the assent of the chairman.
Yeah, well, we had 2 hearings, basically. We were able to afford witnesses, but that's it. We did not subpoena anyone.
Got it. You didn't have subpoena authority.
No.
So, to that end, and as the ranking member has articulated, in 2019, Mr. Chairman Green, you took great issue with the notion
And
that,
I voted against this one coming to my committee, just so you know.
well, I appreciate that you voted against it coming to your committee, but of course I'll yield to.
No, I think we want to be a little bit more honest here with everybody about the circumstances to which this was referred to the committee. It wasn't that there was this bipartisan consensus that we should investigate Secretary Mayorkas and send it to the Homeland Security Committee. Basically, we were responding to an initiative by Marjorie Taylor Greene.
That's right.
You know, yet another one of her impeachment resolutions. And the choice was either a snap impeachment on the spot or a referral. The idea that this is a bipartisan consensus to refer it to the Homeland Security Committee to pursue this is just disingenuous. It's just not the case. It was either a snap impeachment or it was this.
Precisely.
I thank you.
I couldn't agree more. And again, Chairman Green, to the extent that you believed that Ranking Member Thompson and the minority on the Homeland Security Committee ought to have the ability to have subpoena power, as you apparently believed 5 years ago when you voted against the impeachment inquiry against President Trump for that very same reason, you could have easily articulated that. You did not. So again, the hypocrisy, go ahead.
Yeah, we have a policy in the committee. If he wants to subpoena somebody, he can come to me and we do it. We issue the subpoena. He never came to me asking to subpoena anybody, and we authored, every witness he asked to bring got to come.
The resolution, again, the issue that Ranking Member Thompson, of course, I'm happy to yield.
Well, it not necessarily a subpoena, but we asked for a minority day on the committee, and it was denied.
Denied.
It was not denied. We haven't posted a date on it yet. We're following Chairman Nadler's
After the
policy.
impeachment?
That's exactly what happened before in 2019.
So your contention is that apparently will work to schedule a minority day in which you'll be able to hear witnesses after you voted to impeach?
As Chairman Nadler said, there is no precedent for it happening before the articles are brought. Quoting Chairman Nadler,
Again,
the Judiciary Committee which
Chairman,
you sit on.
these are the very same processes that you railed against 5 years ago. This is my point. So, I mean, I get it. I understand. I hear you. You're in the majority. You make the rules. But spare us this, this sort of sense that any of this is intellectually honest or candid. It is not. It's folks saying one thing one day, and then, 5 years later, as the winds shift, saying the other. In any event, I will move on. I will say, I thought that the effort that Ranking Member Thompson and Homeland Security Democrats made to offer an amendment that would have provided standard due process, at least at the bare minimum, to Secretary Mayorkas in the impeachment process was prudent, and the fact that it was rejected by House Republicans in that committee and opposed by you, Mr. Chairman, and every Republican on your committee, I don't understand how that vote can be justified, but that's for you to defend. And Ranking Member, to the extent you'd like to talk about that, I'd welcome it.
Well, I think one of the fundamental tenets of democracy is due process. And I was trying to establish some ground rules by which this impeachment, as it was going forward, that Secretary Mayorkas could at least have an opportunity to present witnesses, to see what the charges were, just basic due. It was denied. In the first hearing, in the formal hearing, I offered an amendment to that process, plain and simple. Every Republican on the committee voted against due process.
I think it's shameful, and while I'm grateful to you, Ranking Member, for initiating that, I regret that our colleagues on the other side of the aisle didn't see it the way that we do. I will just conclude here talking a bit about the substance of this. Well, I use that word liberally. There's very little substance here, but to the extent that you can call it that, I'd like to talk about the actual articles. I read through the resolution that was marked up in the report, as well as the dissenting views, which I thought, the latter of which were incredibly powerful and compelling. Here's what I'm trying to understand. So, Mr. Chairman Green, you, I know, understand the constitutional standard for impeachment of federal officials, presidents, cabinet officials, and so forth, right?
Yeah, I think I do.
What crime are you impeaching Secretary Mayorkas for?
It's very clear that misdemeanors, that was from when our founders wrote it, it did not mean a crime. There was very little crime, criminal law back then.
Okay.
So
What offense are you impeaching? It's not a trick question.
So you want to know why we're
The standard under the Constitution, right?
Yeah.
Bribery, treason, or high crimes and misdemeanors. It sounds like what you're saying is that you are impeaching him for a high crime and misdemeanor.
That is correct,
That's
yes.
your argument. Okay, what high crime and misdemeanor are you referring to?
So 7 instances of basically subverting the laws passed by this body, right? So we said shall detain, and he created systems where he didn't,
Okay,
and created
so the
legal
crime-
pathways that don't exist.
Okay, so
I mean,
the-
you can't just say, hey,
I hear
don't
you.
like the way the immigration laws are written, so I'm just going to do them a different way.
I'm gonna give you an
If he wants
opportunity
to do
to-
that, he can come to Congress and write the law.
Chairman, I'm going to give you an opportunity to expound on this. Okay, so I think what you said was subverting the law. So the high
Yes,
crime and
so-
misdemeanor
yes.
that you believe he should be impeached for is, quote, subverting the law.
Part of
What are
it,
the
yes.
elements of proving that high crime and misdemeanor?
There's no elements of.
How are
proving
you
it.
going to go about proving that during a trial in the Senate?
I have a memorandum from him where he actually orders his employees to do just the opposite of what the law says.
I'm not asking you
Oh, I thought you
for
asked for
the
the evidence.
I'm
Okay.
asking you for the elements, okay? Let me try to explain this to you. And I understand you're not a lawyer by training. I served as one of the prosecutors during the last impeachment,
Yeah.
after January 6th. I stood on the floor of the Senate and made the case to the senators that President Trump should be impeached for a constitutional crime. We laid out specific elements and then made the case for why the evidence, that much of which, of course, it was later further developed by the January 6th committee, ultimately tied into proving those elements.
Well, if you're an attorney,
So,
then you clearly
I'm asking
understand there
you-
are no elements to a high crime. There's no place in the code
So
where there
you're-
says these are the elements of a high crime.
Got it. Okay. So
I mean,
your
you-
contention is that you can, pass a resolution of impeachment, walk into the United States Senate, say, you know what, here's the high crime and misdemeanor, and whatever, if I say I have evidence to prove this crime or misdemeanor, I'm not going to define what the elements are necessary. I'm not going to define the mens rea required to prove this particular crime or offense. I'm just going to say, I believe that he subverted the law, and so therefore
Yeah.
he's impeached.
I mean,
And
he
you should
did
convict him.
subvert the law.
Okay, well,
A judge ordered that, and he'd been to law school.
Mr. Green, Mr. Chairman, all respect here. I can assure you, having studied the records of the Federal Convention, having
As
read
have
the
I.
Federalist Papers,
As
this
have
is
I.
not what the framers had in mind. The notion that there would just be this nebulous phrase, high crimes and misdemeanors, that would extend to anything and everything that you deem a crime, with no definition as to elements of those crimes. That is not what James Madison or the framers of our Constitution had in mind when they conceived of the constitutional standard for impeachment, period. And that's why legal scholars, conservative ones, liberal ones, witnesses that you all used to call before the Judiciary Committee with regularity, Jonathan Turley, many others, have said this is a baseless impeachment. So I have no idea how you are going to go about proving this high crime and misdemeanor in the United States Senate. I suspect that's why they will reject this the moment it comes over, because unlike prior impeachments, that there hasn't been a good faith or cogent attempt to lay out precisely what the offense standard of proof would be and the ways in which the evidence, and I understand you said 400 pages, you believe you have ample evidence of this particular policy violation, which you characterize it that way.
It's laws
I
written by
understand
Congress.
I
Laws,
understand.
very important
I understand,
difference.
but your own words, policy violation
No,
that you believe led to a break in, or rather,
law.
a violation of the law.
Yeah.
So I understand that that's what you said. But I'm just telling you that this is not what the framers had in mind. I think I missed this exchange that my colleague, the distinguished gentlewoman from New Mexico, engaged with you on a colloquy around James Madison and what he said during the federal convention, and the fact that maladministration was specifically rejected.
And I rejected it as well.
And you rejected as well. It's interesting.
Maladministration.
Maladministration,
Right.
got it. You mentioned a 5-phase plan
Yep.
at the beginning
Yep.
of this questioning. You said the first part of that was dereliction of duty.
Yeah.
Do you know what a synonym for dereliction of duty is? If you look in the local, if any
He's
thesaurus,
not brought up
if
here
you
in these
Google it,
articles for-
dereliction
he's
of
brought
duty.
up in the articles
Sir,
for breaking
let me
the
finish
law.
my statement and then you can respond.
Okay, thanks.
The synonym for maladministration, any thesaurus, anybody who's watching, they can Google it, is dereliction of duty. That has been your definitional narrative for this impeachment from day one. It's what you told this group that you attest was, the underpinning, the first part of your 5-part plan. So the notion that this is not anything more than policy differences that have now been, apparently enveloped in supposed violations of the law, I just don't think the American people are going to buy it.
You and I disagree, and I will tell you this, though. If you ever come before my committee, I will never insult you for not understanding what a Whipple procedure is or how diabetic ketoacidosis goes, okay?
I hear you.
I promise you.
I'm not
promise
insulting
that.
you, sir.
Yeah.
I'm not insulting you. The point here is...
I've read the Constitution.
I hear
okay?
you.
I've read, and I'm not an
Impeachment.
unintelligent human being.
Nobody is accusing you
okay,
of that. What I
okay.
am suggesting
I'm
is that
telling you
the
what Madison
impeachment
said, and
constitutional
my
standard...
interpretation of it.
Sir, the impeachment constitutional standard is an exacting one. And when managers, if in fact this impeachment is approved, I understand you're an accomplished position that you've served our country. I have respect for you. What I am suggesting to you is that if and when this resolution passes, managers will be appointed and they will have to walk over to the United States Senate and to present these articles and to prove that in fact the constitutional high crime and misdemeanor has been committed. And what I am saying to you is that your report does not outline the elements of said offense and does not provide a clear roadmap to the country or, in this case, to the accused, the cabinet secretary, who you are trying to impeach for the first, or rather, the second time in the history of the American Republic. There's a reason, sir, that this is rare.
They usually
There's a
resign,
reason,
that's
sir.
why.
There's a
Or get
reason.
fired.
There's a reason why no Congress, Republican-led or Democratic-led, has tried to impeach a cabinet secretary since William Belknap in 1876. 149 years. Another precedent that this Republican Congress is slated to break with apparently great pride. So please don't mistake the passion that I have and that my colleagues have on this side of the aisle for anything but a passion for the Constitution and a very deep concern for the way in which I believe it is being undermined by this proceeding. I will yield back the balance of my time to the chairman.
Thank you very much. The chair would advise the committee and our witnesses that voting is underway. So we're going to recess.
Gentleman yields back to the gentleman from Colorado is now recognized for questions.
I thank the chairman, and I will not take too long. I'm glad I could make it to the hearing for this incredibly riveting discussion that apparently this committee has had multiple times already over the course of the last 13 months. I guess this is the fourth time we're considering this bill in one iteration or another. Literally had a rule on this same bill not too long ago. I'm not sure why the House Republican majority has decided to spend their time in this fashion. I suppose next week we can come back and do a rule on a bill for the 5th time. And meanwhile, as all of these pressing needs of our country and various challenges that merit our consideration in terms of applying and implementing solutions remain unabated without any attention from this Congress and the Republican majority. So, sad state of affairs, but I'll yield to the ranking member to the extent he'd like to.
I'm sure everybody wants to leave the room, but I just, we do, somebody said, but I just wanted to say, again, I didn't mention the SAP, the Biden administration put out a statement of administration policy that strongly opposes this bill. And what they said is, and this is really what I'm trying to point out, is that if you eliminate the public interest analysis, if you say under this bill, which is what this bill is all about, that the administration, whether it's Democrat, Republican, Trump, Biden, whatever, no longer looks at the public interest before these exports take place, then what you're doing, and this is from the SAP, is you're eliminating any review of price on consumers and manufacturers. You're eliminating any environmental impact of the exports. You're eliminating any consideration of whether or not our national security is negatively impacted. So all I'm really saying and pleading with you not to support this bill is that there's absolutely no reason not to look at our security interests, our environmental concerns, or price to consumers and manufacturers in our economy. That's all we're saying here, but thank you again for the time.
I thank the ranking member. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
From this morning's session, I was wondering, for 16, 17 years, the top troika for the House Democrats was Pelosi, Hoyer, Clyburn. And then with Clyburn's moving off of leadership, was there any sort of notation or any sort of observance with Neguse taking over today, sort of about the sort of end of, for lack of a better term, the formal end of an era?
I think Joe Neguse, I'm not going to get too much into what happens in caucus, but I thought Joe Neguse gave an amazing reflection when he spoke to caucus this morning on the contributions of Jim Clyburn, the contributions he's made to the state of South Carolina, to the Democratic caucus, to the country. I thought he did an amazing job, and we all stand on the shoulders of Nancy Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, Jim Clyburn, and their leadership. I've said before, they are the Mount Rushmore of Democratic politicians. The fact that we get to benefit from their ideas and their thoughts, even today, we don't have. It's not like picking up the phone and calling someone who's left. They're here. They're walking these halls. They're sitting in meetings with us. They're sharing their expertise and their knowledge. It's a benefit to the Democratic caucus, every member who gets an opportunity to spend with those leaders, but particularly for those of us who are in leadership positions now, it's an amazing opportunity to learn from them, to listen. Many of us have done that, whether Ted was on the DPCC, I was vice chair. We've sat at these leadership tables, we've been in these meetings and heard those dynamics and have seen them lead and have learned so much from them. So I'm happy that Assistant Democratic Leader Neguse was able to share those reflections about Mr. Clyburn. I'm certain over time there will be other opportunities to reflect on the leadership that he, Nancy Pelosi, and Steny Hoyer have continued to provide to the Democratic caucus. And I'll tell you, Steny Hoyer presented today as ranking member of Financial Services General Government. So we're not done getting leadership out of him, and I think it's a tribute to the caucus and to those individuals. Yeah.
So I just want to say Mr. Clyburn is a legendary member of Congress who has provided principle-inspiring leadership to the Democratic caucus. His wisdom and experience are irreplaceable, and that's why I'm grateful he will be back next term, continuing to help steer our caucus. And I also want to welcome Joe on his new role.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Colleague from Colorado, Representative Joe Neguse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, let me thank the distinguished gentleman, my good friend from the Commonwealth of Kentucky, whose leadership with respect to addressing the scourge of gun violence that has unfortunately taken hold in so many parts of our country has been unparalleled since he first stepped into this august chamber last year. We're grateful for his service, we're grateful for his leadership, and we're grateful for him initiating this important conversation tonight. I must say that there are many constituents of mine who are frustrated, who are outraged, who are anguished at the inaction of this body to address an issue as fundamental as this one. What could be more important, Mr. Speaker, than the safety of our families, of our friends, of our neighbors, of our colleagues, of our children, of our fellow citizens? This Congress has a job to do, and that job must include addressing gun violence and enacting common sense reforms that we know will save lives. I have the distinct privilege, Mr. Speaker, of representing the great state of Colorado, and we have been no stranger to the anguish of gun violence. Next week will mark the 25th anniversary of the tragic and devastating massacre at Columbine High School. 13 Coloradans murdered, cold blood, 12 students and 1 teacher, 25 years ago next week. 3 years ago, my community was devastated by yet another mass shooting at our local grocery store. 10 community members, Mr. Speaker, gunned down, including one police officer who bravely died in the line of duty, saving lives, making the ultimate sacrifice. Mr. Speaker, we have lost far too many. There are far too many mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, children, Americans dying from gun violence. We have the power to stop it if we follow the articulate admonition of my friend and colleague, Mr. McGarvey, by passing common sense solutions here in this chamber. And for those who doubt our ability to do so, Mr. Speaker, I will point you to fairly recent history. There were many who doubted the ability of the United States Congress and the President to enact laws, common sense laws, that ultimately would and could save lives. They were wrong. Because of President Biden's leadership, we passed a bill in the last Congress, the 117th Congress, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. That law is saving lives today. Earlier today, the White House, thanks to the leadership of President Biden, Vice President Harris, the leadership of our Attorney General Garland, announced yet another reform, a new rule pursuant to the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act that will finally close the gun show loophole. An important step forward, Mr. Speaker, and one that I applaud. And I sincerely hope that it can be a building block for us to take on. Now, I have to confess, I looked at the notice from the Rules Committee on which I serve, with great dismay just a few short hours ago. What did that notice portend for next week? What have House Republicans decided we will spend our time on next week? Not gun violence prevention. The Refrigerator Freedom Act. I kid you not. That is literally on the agenda next week. Refrigerator Freedom Act. How about a bill to address gun violence? Is that too much to ask? My constituents don't think so. And I don't think the people of Kentucky think so either. I thank the gentleman from Kentucky again for his leadership, for initiating this important conversation. It is the beginning and not the end. I yield back to the gentleman.
Thank you, Representative.
Speaker, again, I appreciate the passion of the speakers on the other side of the aisle, including the gentlewoman from Wyoming, but facts matter, Mr. Speaker. And this body must dispense with the notion that any of this, the ills that they've spent all this time describing, are attributable to the Biden administration. I will read you a quote. This is from January of 2018, Mr. Speaker. Quote, "I would have preferred a permanent reauthorization," just repeat that, permanent reauthorization of Title VII to protect the safety and security of the nation. By signing this act today, however, I am ensuring that this lawful and essential intelligence program will continue to protect Americans for at least the next 6 years. We cannot let our guard down in the face of foreign threats to our safety, our freedom, and our way of life. President Donald J. Trump. So, spare us lectures about the need for, I understand we're going to have robust debates about the mechanics and the nuances with respect to this particular bill, but spare us lectures about the need for a shorter runway and a shorter reauthorization when the former president, whom apparently the House Republican caucus continues to take orders from, made clear and abundant his desire for a permanent reauthorization of this program, with none of these reforms, by the way, none of them. Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman from Colorado reserves. Gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Neguse.
Well, I hope the chairman is as indulgent with Democratic members as he was with our colleague from Louisiana.
I think Ms. Stansbury went over about
All right, well, I appreciate that. I will just say this. I don't know that maybe my friend is confused about the particular witness that we're hearing from today. Ms. Haaland is not the Secretary of State. She's not the Secretary of Homeland Security. She's the Secretary of Interior. And in my view, she's doing an effective job. And I would also say, I think the questions in particular that were posed by the gentleman from Louisiana, and perhaps he didn't mean to convey them this way, but context matters. I know that the Secretary has a bone-deep commitment to the United States. Perhaps he's unaware that her father is a veteran, was a distinguished officer in the United States Marine Corps who earned a Silver Star for his service during the Vietnam War. I find it offensive.
Is the gentleman suggesting something I said was inaccurate?
Mr. Graves, it is not your time, it is my time.
I wanted to make sure I understood.
To the extent the chairman wishes to
I wanted to
intervene,
make sure I
perhaps he can,
understood.
because I haven't yielded time to anyone. I'm addressing the Secretary, and I say to you, Madam Secretary, that we are proud of your service and your family's service to our country, and grateful for the work that you were doing at the Department of Interior. Notwithstanding the histrionics from, unfortunately, some of my colleagues today, I'm surprised by it, to be candid. As you know, Madam Secretary, and it's good to see you, and welcome back to the Natural Resources Committee, I'm proud to represent the 2nd Congressional District of Colorado, which includes the headwaters of the Colorado River, and to serve as co-chair of the bipartisan Colorado River Caucus. We have been grateful for the communication and the leadership of your agency as we continue to face drought conditions throughout the Colorado River Basin. I understand, of course, that the department is currently developing post-2026 operating guidelines for the Colorado River through a multi-year and collaborative stakeholder process. I think it's important that we acknowledge the need to be proactive, in our efforts to conserve this critical resource rather than the solely reactionary and crisis-driven. To that end, I'm proud that we've introduced 2 bills, one of which has passed the Natural Resources Committee and passed the House on a bipartisan basis, the Drought Preparedness Act, which would support a critical program in your department, Madam Secretary, that the Bureau of Reclamation uses, the Drought Response Program, to provide assistance through drought contingency planning, drought resiliency projects, and emergency response actions. I'm hoping the Senate will take that bill up. As you know, your budget request includes $25 million for the Drought Response Program. I wonder if you could briefly talk about how that investment will help increase drought mitigation work in the Colorado River Basin.
Thank you very much, Congressman, and I thank you for recognizing how important the drought response programs are as part of the $66 million request for water smart programs to work cooperatively with communities to address water shortages. I will just tell you that if those authorities are not reauthorized, the drought response program, it provides assistance to water managers to build long-term resiliency to drought. As you know, people have said that it's a 1,200-year drought in the West, and you recognize that every single day, as I do, being a New Mexican. And so we feel these programs are incredibly important so we can continue to do the work and make sure that communities have the water that they need.
Well, I thank you, Madam Secretary, and I certainly hope that the Senate will heed your call and our call to pass that bipartisan bill, as well as the House with respect to the second bill in reference to the authorities that you mentioned. I just want to briefly touch on SRS, the Secure Rural Schools and the Payments in Lieu of Taxes program. Of course, understanding that NRS is primarily a Forest Service program, SRS is primarily a Forest Service program, but there is a portion operated by the Bureau of Land Management. We've introduced legislation. It's bipartisan legislation. Representative McMorris Rogers of Washington is the co-sponsor to reauthorize the SRS program for an additional 3 years. The program is critical for rural communities across the country, including communities in my district. This program has broad bipartisan support. There are 70 co-sponsors on this particular bill, and I'm certainly grateful for that. But unfortunately, I'll just say, Madam Secretary, that we've been frustrated that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have not put this bill on the floor for a vote. The authorization lapsed, as you know, back in September of 2023. There are a lot of communities and congressional districts that will be harmed if we don't get this bill done. Just to give you, by way of example, Chairman Bence's district received more than $51 million. Representative Fulcher, whom him and I have worked closely together for many years, his district received $16.6 million. I know, Representative Lamalfa, you care about this program, $11.4 million in your district. We've got to get this done. I know the department is supportive of this effort. I'm just hoping that we can implore the Speaker and perhaps, Mr. Chairman, we can enlist your support in getting this done so that all of our communities in rural America aren't harmed disproportionately. I thank the chairman for his indulgence. I yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Lamalfa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for appearing with us today, Madam Secretary. Welcome back.
Mr. Langworthy. Mr. Neguse?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Chairman Duncan and Ranking Member Pallone, for your testimony and for being here today. Mr. Duncan, I don't want to belabor the point here, but I listened with great interest to your primer on the constitutional order of our country and the principles of limited government as you see it, and your perceptions about supposed overreach by the federal government in this case that apparently was the impetus for the Hands Off Our Home Appliances Act. I think House Republicans at least were wise enough to keep the rest of their bills, the Refrigerator Freedom Act and the like, from the floor this week. But nonetheless, I listened to that primer with great interest. Some of the words you used, just in response to my colleague from New York's questions, were too much government, freedom to choose, which of course is, ironic given the position of House Republicans in undermining the right, the freedom to make one's own health reproductive decisions. But I guess what I really would like for you to help expound to me is where you draw the line when it comes to what you describe as too much government. You said there's too much government in selecting one's toaster, I guess, or one's refrigerator, apparently, or one's washer and dryer. You went through this litany of examples. Where do you draw the line?
Where do I draw the line on what?
Yeah, how do you see, you take issue with the federal government's role, in this case, with respect to the bill that you all have proposed. Where do you draw the line as to how much government is too much government?
Well, there's 17 enumerated powers in the United States Constitution, and I think government has well exceeded that. I think a return to a smaller, limited federal government is better.
Okay.
That's how our founders envisioned this.
That's helpful. That's what I was hoping you would say. You believe there's too much government in appliances, or the selection thereof. Do you think there's too much government in baseball?
I don't think government has a role in baseball.
You don't think government has a role in baseball? That's fascinating. Are you familiar with the Competition in Professional Baseball Act?
Well, there's some antitrust laws.
No, I didn't ask you that. I asked if you're familiar with that bill. I mean, I hope you'd be familiar with it because it's your bill.
I am, yeah.
Right? Yeah. You authored the Competition in Professional Baseball Act. That bill does what? It amends the Clayton Act to ultimately eliminate one of the antitrust exemptions that exists for professional baseball. You're familiar with the Clayton Act, yes?
I am.
And the Clayton Act is designed to do what? Protect consumers, is that right? Is the Clayton Act part of the 17 enumerated powers of the federal government under the Constitution as you see it, that you hold so true and fast to?
Probably.
Probably? Okay, so looks like we found an exception. Maybe we can go down the list of some others. You see my point, Mr. Duncan.
I said it's too much government.
Oh, yeah, I understand, but apparently too much government in the case of the bill that you proposed, but not too much government in the case of professional baseball, where apparently you've introduced a bill, or at least you introduced a bill.
Trying to roll back
Hold
some
on,
of
Mr.
government,
Duncan, I'll finish
just
my
like this is
statement,
trying.
and I'll give you an opportunity to respond, in which you introduced a bill in the last Congress to give the FTC more powers so that it could regulate professional baseball. So you could imagine, I think, my surprise, and I suspect for those who are watching, their surprise to hear you defend liberty for refrigerators, but then demand that the federal government intervene in the regulation of professional baseball. I find that a bit disconnected from the philosophy that you've articulated. But I'm happy to...
Well, there's already antitrust laws out there that baseball has to operate under. And trying to roll back some of that is lessening government's involvement.
Yeah, again, that's not the nature of your bill. The bill provides for an amendment of
the laws already exist.
Let me finish my statement here. The Clayton Act, which, as you know, is over 100 years old, does not include baseball, and the courts, going back a generation, have ruled that professional baseball is not subject to the antitrust laws of the United States of America. You, sir, have introduced a bill to mandate that professional baseball be subject to the antitrust laws of the United States and to give the Federal Trade Commission the powers to regulate it thereof. You shouldn't be embarrassed by it. That's your position.
I'm not, because there were antitrust violations. And so the antitrust laws, I didn't write. The
I hear you.
antitrust laws were on the books.
And apparently you believe
And
that
baseball was
it's in
given
the
an
interest of the American public for the federal government to have a role to protecting consumers, which you've spent the better part of the last half hour attacking that very view.
Antitrust laws fall under commerce, which the federal government enumerated powers to regulate.
Sure. Well, you have a broader view of the Commerce Clause than certainly than apparently the framers that you were describing previously. But to the extent that you care to jump in, Ranking Member Pallone, about the regulation of professional baseball, you're welcome to. But
talk about baseball, but I just think, look, this kind of goes back to what Congresswoman Scanlon said, right? The public assumes that the government has a role in protecting consumers, right? Whether it's baseball, it's food safety, it's appliances, whatever. And so I think that to suggest that there's some kind of ideological view that says that the government shouldn't play that role is not the case. That's what the public assumes. And they'd be shocked to hear, I think, some of the statements here today suggesting that, you know, we just have this market economy where anything goes and the federal government shouldn't step in and regulate things. That's not what I hear from my constituents. They want us to regulate problems if there's, I don't know what there is, but let's assume there's some kind of shady dealings in baseball. They want to make sure that when they go to the game, there's fair play. Same thing with food safety, same thing with appliances. They rely on us to help them as consumers, and to suggest that that somehow is not what the framers intended, I don't agree.
couldn't say better than the ranking member, and couldn't agree with you more. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the gentlewoman from Indiana for the customary 30 minutes. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Without objection.
Madam Speaker, today is a serious day, a serious moment for this institution. Apparently, according to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, House Republicans, we're gathered here today to discuss a very consequential question, a consequential issue facing the country, Madam Speaker: home appliances, toasters, microwaves, refrigerators. Those are the topics, Madam Speaker, that House Republicans have chosen to waste this institution's time on. Of all the challenges facing the country, of all of the issues facing our community, apparently, their top priority is the so-called Hands-Off Home Appliances Act. Madam Speaker, you may recall that Republicans noticed a Rules Committee meeting on this very same bill just a few weeks ago. That bill was then hastily removed. We assumed, because our colleagues on the other side of the aisle were essentially shamed into pulling it from the agenda. They realized that a bill on home appliances probably doesn't meet the moment, considering all of the real crises that we have going on. But apparently that shame only lasted for a few weeks, because today's legislation, Hands-Off Home Appliances Act, is back apparently for round 2. And just to be clear, Madam Speaker, I know you're aware of this. This is a package deal. This isn't the only appliance bill that Republicans have noticed for this body to consider. The Liberty and Laundry Act, this is the real title of the bill that House Republicans would like this body to consider. The Refrigerator Freedom Act, the Clothes Dryers Reliability Act, the Affordable Air Conditioning Act, the Stop Unaffordable Dishwasher Standards Act. Those bills, I guess, didn't make the cut for this particular rules debate. I suppose we'll take those up next week. Madam Speaker, this House should be focused on addressing the consequential challenges of our time, not on political games, messaging bills. How far this body has fallen. The same august chamber where James Madison and Abraham Lincoln once served, now debasing itself, debating the fate of microwaves and toaster ovens, because that's how House Republicans have decided to spend their time and their majority. My colleagues, regrettably, unfortunately, are out of touch with the priorities of the American people. The American people expect, rightfully so, for this chamber to address the issues that they care about, not waste time on nonsense bills. And by the way, Madam Speaker, the rest of the measures that we'll consider today, unfortunately, are more of the same. H.R. 7109, the so-called Equal Representation Act, is plainly unconstitutional. Any plain reading of the Constitution in the 14th Amendment makes clear that this bill is unconstitutional. House Republicans pushing forward anyways. Another bill that we're considering today, yet another CRA, this time on apparently a bulletin that was issued by the Securities and Exchange Commission. I have lost count of how many days we've wasted in the last 17 months considering CRAs. Every week, another CRA submitted by our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. One would have hoped, Mr. Speaker, that House Republicans would have learned their lesson a year ago after wasting our time on CRAs for the lesser prairie chicken and the northern long-eared bat, that perhaps this House could focus its attention on more substantive matters. Unfortunately, that has not been the case. Finally, Mr. Speaker, the last bill that this body will consider this week, the Mining Regulatory Clarity Act. Of course, this bill is, I know, familiar to you, Mr. Speaker. It is to me, because we voted on a rule about this particular bill 7 days ago. Why is it back before us a week later? I'll tell you why. Republican leadership has lost control of the Rules Committee. They lost control months ago. Now they often lack a procedural majority here on the House floor. Last week, our colleague, Representative Ledger-Fernandez, introduced a motion to recommit. The motion to recommit was very simple. It pointed out the fact that the Republicans' mining bill would allow foreign adversarial nations to mine American land
for free. What happened to that motion to recommit? It passed. 6 Republicans joined every Democrat in supporting that motion to recommit. Those familiar with Schoolhouse Rock would understand that that means the bill goes back to committee, the House Committee on Natural Resources, where I serve, Mr. Speaker, where you serve, so that we could work out the issues that this body on a bipartisan basis identified with this bill 7 days ago. Instead, House Republicans have brought the very same bill back to this body for its consideration without going to the Natural Resources Committee. I have no idea how the 6 Republicans who voted for the motion to recommit last week can possibly defend or rationalize a vote against the motion to recommit this week. I suppose we're going to find out. Mr. Speaker, there are better ways for this chamber to be spending its time. I'd implore the Speaker, I'd implore my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, let's get serious. Let's work together to address some of the consequential challenges that face our respective states, our country. And let's stop with these nonsense bills. I implore you. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Colorado reserves. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
Colorado is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. I also want to thank the gentlewoman from Vermont for providing this committee and obviously those who are watching it with some sense of real semblance of the actual facts on the ground with respect to the comments made by my colleague from Wisconsin. Director, I first want to say thank you for your service to our country. You've spent your career in law enforcement, obviously a former federal prosecutor. I'm grateful for the work that you and your agency does each and every day to keep communities across my district in Colorado and Rocky Mountain West and the entire country safe. You have more patience than I. I think it is awfully rich, and I'm not asking you to opine on this or to respond, but it's awfully rich for some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to lecture you, who've spent your career in law enforcement, leading one of the premier domestic law enforcement agencies now, to lecture you about crime and gun trafficking when they have worked vociferously over the last 17 months to defund the very agency that you lead that is charged with addressing gun trafficking, is charged with keeping us safe. I think it is shameful. How much did President Biden's fiscal year 24 budget request identify for the ATF? What was the total sum?
I believe that the number that I'm very familiar with is the amount of the cut, which was $47.5 million, that was the real salary and expenses cut, which is causing us not to hire agents, which is causing us not to be able to be out there with our state and local partners arresting carjackers and violent criminals. The request is 3 or 4 steps. It was a significant increase for ATF funding, and not only was the increase not granted, but ATF's budget was cut, and that's having these kinds of effects on our ability to fight violent crime that I'm talking about.
Well, you beat me to it, and thank you, Mr. Director, because I think you've provided the requisite clarity. $47 million cut. $3 billion less than what the president ultimately requested. $1.9 billion was the president's request in terms of funding for the ATF. Ultimately, it's about $1.6 billion, which meant in real dollars a $47 million cut.
Right. Went from 1.675 to about 1.625.
Correct.
And by the way, that happened halfway through the year because Congress hadn't passed a budget, and so we had to effectuate the entire $47 million cut in 6 months, which was also, Congress delays in passing these measures. I understand they're difficult, but for people running organizations, and many of you have run businesses, that is very, very difficult to effectuate a whole cut after somebody is giving you the higher budget for half the year and says, "Hey, make it all up in a half year."
Well, I'd like to hear any of my colleagues defend the propriety of pursuing that kind of cut to one of our nation's lead law enforcement agencies. The cognitive dissonance is astounding to me. I mean, I've listened for years to my colleagues on the other side claim that folks in our party don't support law enforcement, which of course couldn't be further from the truth. And yet, simultaneously, they now pursue a significant cut to the operations of the ATF. I'm grateful, and by the way, Director, I mean, this is outside of your bailiwick, so to speak, but they just released a budget a month ago that proposes severe cuts to local law enforcement as well. Rural sheriffs, rural police departments in my district, COPS grant program, which I'm sure you're familiar with, given your time as a prosecutor years ago. Program that is integral to enabling local law enforcement to do their jobs, to hire more officers. I think it's shameful. I'm grateful for what, as I said, you are doing. I wish I had more time to be able to spend or perhaps engage in a colloquy here around some of the regulations that the ATF has promulgated, which I support, to address some of the mass violence, mass shootings that we have tragically had in communities across the country, including in my community in Boulder, Colorado. But I would just say that the sum of my remarks is that I'm grateful for the work that you do. I'm grateful for the work that the law enforcement officers in your agency do each and every day. And you certainly will have our support. And I would hope that it'd be on a bipartisan basis. Hope springs eternal. We'll keep working towards that. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. What's your budget this year?
The budget, I believe, is $1.625 billion was the most recent budget that was passed.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Yields back. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Attorney General, it would be inappropriate for you to opine on the nature of pending and active prosecutions, correct?
Yes, there's a Justice Department policy against making those kind of comments.
It's longstanding precedent.
Yes.
The reason why I bring that up, I have great respect for my colleague from New Jersey. I understand he is not a lawyer by training, and the world needs good dentists, so it's nothing against his career choices. But I will just simply say, I find it shameful to have to endure, and I can only imagine how you feel about it, Mr. Attorney General, the lectures from some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle about equal justice under the law or adherence to the rule of law to a man who has spent virtually his entire career in pursuit of upholding the rule of law. You talked a bit about your professional background. You started at the Department of Justice as a line prosecutor. I know you served as a special assistant prior to that, but the bulk of your early career at the Department of Justice was a line prosecutor.
Yes.
Drug trafficking, organized crime, violent crime cases.
Yes.
You then proceeded to become the principal associate deputy attorney general.
Yes. Long title.
Long title, important job. And in that capacity, you oversaw a series of very important criminal prosecutions, including the prosecutions connected to the Oklahoma City bombing. Is that right?
Yes.
You were nominated and you were confirmed on a bipartisan basis here in Washington, D.C., to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals.
Yes.
You rose to chief judge of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals.
I think that just meant I survived my colleagues, yes.
That may be, Mr. Attorney General, but what I can say with confidence is that you have a more distinguished record with respect to fidelity to the rule of law than any member sitting on the dais here today on either side of the aisle. And I appreciate your integrity, your leadership of the department, and to be candid, your patience during the bulk of this hearing, which of course has focused on virtually every issue unconnected to the bulk of the work that is done by our nation's premier law enforcement agency. I've been in and out of this hearing. I believe it's correct that you haven't gotten any questions about cybercrime, let's say, for example.
That's right.
Fair enough. Or foreign espionage.
Right.
I know during your opening statement you talked about the decisive action that the Department of Justice is taking in coordination with the DEA and the FBI against cartels. Very few questions about that today from my colleagues, unfortunately, unless I'm wrong.
You're right.
A litany of work that's being done each and every day at the Department of Justice that has a real impact on people's lives in terms of keeping our communities safe, keeping Americans safe. This was supposed to be, I thought, an oversight hearing for the Department of Justice. And unfortunately, it has descended into a lot of rhetoric about conspiracy theories and the like. I think it's a wasted opportunity to actually engage with you and your department about the issues that the American people care deeply about. And so I will spend the remaining amount of my time left talking about an issue that's deeply important to me, and I know an issue that's important to you, which is the scourge of gun violence. And the department has taken a leadership role under your tenure in the last several years, particularly as it relates to implementing the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which was a bipartisan bill that this Congress passed thanks to President Biden's leadership. And I wonder if you might just opine a bit or expound a bit on your work as it relates to gun violence.
Well, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act has been extraordinarily helpful in our effort to combat gun violence. It's led to substantial numbers of prohibited sales of guns to minors who the statutes prohibit possessing because of conduct that they have engaged in. It's given us the authority to bring cases for straw purchasing that's led to crime guns and to gun trafficking to criminals, and in those ways has helped drive down the numbers with respect to gun violence. We have set up crime gun intelligence centers so that our state and local counterparts can trace guns that are found at crime scenes to determine whether they were used by serial killers, by serial shooters, to help us find out, to run the DNA off of the casings so that we can find hits on those people and arrest them and prevent them from committing further crimes. There's a host of things that the department has done. But the principal kind of violence we're worried about in the country is gun violence. That's what causes the enormous number of deaths we face every year.
I thank you, Mr. Attorney General, for your service to our country, and I hope you'll relay the same to all the folks at the Department of Justice, and I thank the chairman for his indulgence. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Alabama.
Our Assistant Leader, Joe Neguse.
Thank you, Congresswoman Sewell. It is impossible to follow Mr. Clyburn, but I will certainly try. But one of the privileges that we have in the United States Congress is serving with living legends, with true giants, not all members, mind you, but some true giants. And Mr. Clyburn is one of those giants, a living legend, an icon, a hero, who spoke eloquently, as you just heard, about his parents' journey and struggle against segregation, who spoke eloquently about his friend and our dear colleague, the late John Lewis, and his struggle in the civil rights movement. But what you did not hear Mr. Clyburn talk about or discuss was his own work as a young man growing up in the segregated South in a small town in South Carolina, protesting and marching for civil rights, jailed as a young man where he met his future wife, and the work that he did to ultimately ensure that folks like myself and Representative Sewell and Chairman Aguilar, so many others, would even have the opportunity to serve in this distinguished body. So we're grateful to Mr. Clyburn for his legacy of service to our country and for continuing the clarion call to make the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act a reality. We're also deeply grateful to Congresswoman Sewell, who has been a fierce champion for getting this done since the first day that she arrived here on Capitol Hill. It has been a long journey, and there is more road for us to traverse. But I am confident with Representative Sewell's leadership and the incredible leaders here at the podium and in our House Democratic Caucus that we will ultimately get this bill one day signed into law. We talked about heroes. Of course, one of those heroes is Mr. Lewis. And one of my favorite quotes, of course, there's many quotes of his that I know sustain many of us, but one of my favorite quotes is when he once said that the vote is the most powerful, non-violent tool that we have. And I'm reminded of that this week as we mark
the 11-year anniversary of the disastrous Shelby decision and the work that must be done to protect that sacrosanct tool for every single American. The key to doing that is passing this bill that Representative Sewell has implored the Congress to take up. And we will continue to support her in her efforts every step of the way.
Bring a gentleman up here, my colleague, the congressman from Colorado. He is the future. He is our assistant Democratic leader that will become our assistant to the Speaker in the United States House of Representatives, Congressman Joe Neguse.
Well, it is difficult, if not impossible, to follow our chairwoman emeritus, who spoke with such clarity of conviction about the next president of the United States, Kamala Harris. It's impossible to follow Chairman Horsford and Chairman Meeks, but I will try. I am filled today with a sense of gratitude and pride. Maya Angelou once said that people may forget what you did, they may forget what you said, they'll never forget how you made them feel. President Biden did a lot during his consequential term in office, the most significant policy achievements since the Great Society of the 1960s. He said a lot, powerful articulations of the work we must do to protect our democracy. But what I think about today is how he made us feel. Every single American, that we mattered to him, that we mattered to each other. I'm filled with a sense of pride and gratitude for the president's decision-making, for his leadership, and the wisdom that he displayed in selecting an incredibly exceptional woman to be his vice president, and now, ultimately, to be our next president of the United States. It is fitting, at a time of great euphoria here for the Black Caucus, that we also find ourselves in mourning. Yesterday, we honored our dearly departed colleague, our beloved friend, Judge Sheila Jackson Lee from the great state of Texas. And as we gathered on the floor, Representative Mfume was reminding us that we stand on the shoulders of the giants who came before, and that Sheila Jackson Lee had taken that baton from Barbara Jordan and carried it forward. And I imagine she's looking down today with great pride in the president and in the next president of the United States. I will say just one word about Kamala Harris. You've heard this from Chairwoman Emeritus Beatty, from Chair Horsford, from Chairman Meeks. It bears repeating. She is the most experienced candidate for President of the United States in a quarter century. She served as Attorney General, she served as a county prosecutor, she served as a United States Senator, and she has served for the better part of the last 4 years as Vice President of the United States. Her achievements will stand the test of time. And I cannot wait to Chairwoman Emeritus Beatty's point, to hold my daughter's hand, who's 5 years old, on January 20th, and see this incredibly talented black woman become President of the United States of America. It is a moment that we will work towards and secure over the course of these next 105 days, because we know everything is on the line. If we do our job, we will make that dream come true. And a key component of that dream, because when Vice President Harris becomes President Harris, she's going to need governing partners. We know she's going to have a Democratic majority led by Speaker Hakeem Jeffries in the U.S. House of Representatives, but the Senate matters too. And she will have a new governing partner in the United States Senate, someone whom she knows well, someone she trusts, someone who is a trailblazer in her own right, the first black woman to be the next U.S. Senator from the great state of Delaware, Lisa Blunt Rochester.
Good evening, Chicago. My name is Joe Neguse, and I represent the great state of Colorado in the U.S. Congress. My parents immigrated here from a place torn apart by war. They worked hard every day, made tremendous sacrifices, and taught me to never take for granted the educational opportunities that we have in this incredible country. It's because of them and because of those opportunities that tonight their son stands before you as Assistant Democratic Leader of the U.S. House of Representatives. My fellow Americans, let me say this clearly. Don't let anyone tell you that the American dream is dead. It is alive and well, and it will grow even stronger with Kamala Harris as the next President of the United States. How do we know that? How do I know that? Well, it's because Kamala Harris believes that college can be a ticket to the middle class, and she has fought to make it more affordable her entire career. As California Attorney General, she took down one of the biggest for-profit colleges, securing $1 billion for students who were defrauded. Alongside President Biden, she expanded Pell Grants and secured record funding for HBCUs. And Kamala Harris made public service loan relief a reality for teachers and first responders and firefighters and nurses and countless others across our land. Vice President Harris delivered before, and she will do it again. As president, she will build a brighter future, a more affordable future, a future where going to college doesn't break the bank, a future where my 5-year-old daughter, Natalie, who's watching us back home in Colorado right now, a future where she can live her dreams. So those are the stakes. Let's make it happen, America. Let's make history, America. Let's elect Kamala Harris the 47th President of the United States. Thanks so much. God bless.
So, but thank you, Mr. Chair. And I really won't, I don't want to ask a lot of questions or talk very long. I just want to say this makes sense. And no matter what the talking points from the Democrats are, the fact remains that the Senate Democrats have not done their work. I think Mr. Harris laid that out very well in his opening statement and again in another response to the chairman. But we are in the position that we have to do this because the Senate Democrats didn't do their work. And I don't know if we can express that enough because there's so much going on from the talking points from the other side about veterans and about all kinds of things, all the other horrible things you can think of that, but then why didn't the Senate Democrats do the work if there was that much concern? And there was that. So that's all I really wanted to say, and Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman. Our jobs here, and then we can blame the other people for not doing their jobs. But we haven't done our job here by any measure. I thank the gentleman. I yield back.
Chair, thanks the gentleman. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
I thank the chairman, and thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member, for your testimony today. Just to underscore a point that our ranking member of the Rules Committee, I think, well articulated, and just to be clear on the facts, my understanding is the House has not sent a single appropriations bill for the next fiscal year to the United States Senate. The House passed a few bills, as Mr. Harris mentioned. Of course, Republicans failed to pass appropriation bills for agriculture, rural development, Food and Drug Administration, commerce, justice, science, and related agencies, energy and water development and related agencies, financial services and general government, labor, health, and human services, education and related agencies, and then finally transportation, housing, and HUD. So, wide variety of appropriation bills that the Republican majority has failed to pass, and the limited bills they have passed, they've refused to send to the United States Senate for the Senate's consideration. So I think characterization to the contrary is a bit rich and untrue. Mr. Harris, I guess one question I wanted to ask you and get a better sense of, it's clear by virtue of your testimony and the decisions made by the Republican majority that the SAVE Act is very important to you and you believe important to the country. Is that fair?
It's important to the American people, that's correct.
it's important enough, in your view, to attach to this continuing resolution, right?
In my view, and I think in the opinion of the American people, they expect that people in this country illegally are not going to be voting in federal elections.
And that's why you've added that provision to the CR, as opposed to taking that bill up in regular order next week or the week after or in October or November, right?
We did take it up, and if the gentleman will remember, it passed the House with 5 minority members agreeing and is sitting over in the Senate. So the bill has been taken up. It's just that we can't, Chuck Schumer refuses to do the work of the American people and, for instance, take up the SAVE Act, because again, I'll reiterate, I suspect that he believes it actually might pass in the Senate. And why it wouldn't, I'm not sure, because I think everyone should agree that people who are in the country illegally shouldn't vote in a federal election. But the fact is, we did take it up, and the Senate refuses, Mr. Schumer refuses to put it on the voting schedule in the Senate.
So then why put it in the CR?
Well, if it comes over with the CR, that's a, you know, and I've been around here long enough to know there are such things that are called must-pass bills. The CR is considered a must-pass bill at some point, and attaching something like the SAVE Act to it might actually reinforce with the American people that Congress actually does believe that only American citizens should vote in American elections.
And given that point, Mr. Harris, why not do the same thing for the $12 billion in funding that the VA needs to take care of our nation's veterans? If you believe that a signal of how important legislation is to include it in the CR, that it's something that can't be taken up during the duration of a CR through the next fiscal year, through March of 2025, that demonstrates that it's an issue of vital importance. What could be more important than the $12 billion that the VA desperately needs to provide care for our nation's veterans? Why put that on the back burner?
So I'll remind the gentleman that the military construction VA bill that was passed by the Republicans in the House actually increased funding for the veterans, and the Democrat minority voted against increasing that funding for the VA. That bill is over in the Senate.
It's not in the Senate. You didn't send it.
Only the DHS bill was held pending passage of H.R. 2. So the Senate could take up their, if Mr. Schumer and the Democrat majority in the Senate felt that the veteran issue was so important, they in fact could take up the military construction VA bill in the Senate, and we could conference rapidly and solve this problem by next week. So I would suggest that, I mean,
why not
that's
do it
my
now?
answer. I would suggest you write a note to Mr. Schumer and ask him why he's
Mr.
not
Harris,
taking them up.
I would just simply say, it is completely within the power of the Republican majority to address it today in this CR. It's not particularly complicated. The Republican majority could decide that addressing our veterans' health care needs is as important as the wide variety of other anomalies that the Republican majority has settled on, as important as the SAVE Act, as the Republican majority clearly believes it to be, and included in this bill. The Republican majority made a decision not to do so. I don't understand why, and I don't think the answer, or a answer rather, that this can be something that can be addressed in December or January or February, that it can be addressed at some point during the pendency of a 6-month CR. I think that answer is not going to comport with the needs of the American people. I think they will find that answer deeply disquieting. Ranking Member DeLauro, if you care to expound on that.
Well, first of all, I would just say, let me just make a point on the issue of eligibility of non-citizens, whether to vote or otherwise. But what the CR does is shuts down the E-Verify program, I might add, which is our nation's system to confirm the eligibility of non-citizens to work lawfully in the United States. So it really
Could you
is,
just repeat that, Ranking Member DeLauro? You're saying
They
the
shut
Republican CR bill shuts down the E-Verify
E-Verify
program. Okay.
which is our nation's system to confirm the eligibility of non-citizens to work lawfully in the United States. So It's my, it should be. Okay. I think it's, this veterans issue is really a critical issue. There's a $12 billion shortfall, and I explained that the increase demand for services, we understood that when we passed the PACT Act because it extends to all altercations here. So $12 billion shortfall. It's medical services for veterans. And this is, you can read, the VA would have, this is the OMB, VA would have insufficient funding to maintain medical care operations for veterans through 2025. Absent this funding, VA need to begin addressing any potential shortfall as early as the first quarter of fiscal year 2025. So $0 here. And the most, and it's really a little crazy here because you look at section 144 of the CR, and it gives the VA authority to spend funding provided in this CR for medical service faster than they normally would be allowed. But there are $0 in the bill for medical services. So they're going to spend $0 as fast as they can. Now, it would be laughable if it were not serious for veterans that are faced with grave illnesses and they simply need to get their medical care. You know, to your point, you ask your colleagues in the majority, how hard is it to do the right thing?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Ranking Member, and you know, this notion that the CR as written is some sacred parchment that can't be modified in any way is contravened by the manager's amendment that I understand Chairman Cole has submitted that would address some issues with respect to TANF funding. So clearly it is within the majority's power to address what is a very salient issue, a distressing issue that the VA has identified. According to the Office of Management and Budget, I'll simply quote from their letter to the Congress that, quote, the VA would have insufficient funding to maintain medical care operations for veterans through fiscal year 2025, period. That's the bottom line. So a vote for this bill is a vote that ultimately would deprive the VA of their ability to care for our nation's veterans. It's why I'll be voting no on the CR and why I'll be encouraging my colleagues to do the same. I yield back.